This time it's a wintry river with cold water down the middle and ice round the edges. Just a quick recap on the story so far. The base has been cut away from foam and then covered with a light layer of ballast. The river itself has a resin base, which means a two-part epoxy. The most important thing for that is putting a dam in. So I sand the front to make sure that it's all nice and smooth and I can get a flush fit, and I use acetate just glued in place to create a resin-proof dam. I really like resin, and this is a simple and effective one to use. You do need to wear gloves as it is fairly noxious stuff, and it's a 1-to-1 mix, so you can just pour the same amount into each of 2 measuring cups. I'm using an acrylic model paint to add a little bit of a grey colour to the bottom layer. Once that's mixed in half, you can add the other side in, mix them together and pour them between the 2 cups until it's all well and truly mixed. You will have bubbles, but we'll deal with those in a minute. They recommend leaving it for half an hour, and in that time I decided I wanted it a bit darker, so I added a little bit of a darker grey into there, and then I just poured it in a thin stream into my diorama. I let it tip from one end to the other to make sure it covered where I wanted, and I used a stick to make sure it flowed to the edges properly. And now to deal with those bubbles. The answer is a chef's blowtorch. You just wave it quickly over the surface and they just magically pop. You may need to come back and do it a couple of times. The next morning the first layer was set, so I mixed a slightly more translucent dark grey over the top. I didn't want to put much opacity in. And then I just poured that before popping all the bubbles again. To avoid fingerprints in your resin, keep one of the mixing bowls. And when it's set, you can remove the dams and take off the meniscus. It always rises a bit towards the edges, but you can get rid of that with a knife. The banks of winter rivers have beautiful icy effects, and I replicated those by using model water, it's artificial water, Modell-Wasser, and the pulverschnee. I added a really small amount, not all this paint went in, a very small amount of grey paint, just to change the colour slightly, and I put it along the edges of the river. I left the central channel open, as you often see, and just did a nice wavy effect ice. And I hoped it would just blend a little bit into the snow around the edges, creating a nice line. When all that was dry, it was on to making the waves. I used a thin layer of resin. Now I let it sit for about 3 hours before I put it on, so it was a little bit thicker and it wouldn't just run everywhere. And then I pushed it up against the edge of that ice. I need the ice to be fairly flat. It's not a huge ramp up from the water, so by the time this thickness of resin is in, it should be more or less level. About 2 hours later, I came back and scored in some waves with a cocktail stick. Now the resin isn't set yet, so these will mostly smooth out, and this will vary depending on the temperature of your room. I scored the area under the bridge far less because it was more sheltered. Another hour later and I came back and used, this is actually one of those free stirrer sticks you get from a coffee shop, and I pushed the resin. It was too thick really to score anymore, and I pushed it into very large waves so I'd get a nice flowing effect. And this is the result the next morning. I'm really pleased how it came out. I did consider adding some white in, like in the backdrop picture, but in the end I liked it as it was.